So let's start, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome, everyone. The Criminal Law Society, and many thanks to Juliet Park, and the Center for Science and Justice, which I direct, and our new executive director, Tom Maher, is here. Wanted to introduce you to him. We're all really excited to welcome back to the law school Dr. Ashley Nellis, Senior Research Analyst at the Sentencing Project, based in Washington, D.C. She's going to talk to us about her new book, The Meaning of Life. She's done more work than anyone in this country documenting the scale, the scope, and the harm of long sentences, and in particular life sentences, virtual life sentences, life without parole sentences. You can read reports that she's authored and co-authored as part of the Sentencing Project, surveying across the country, contacting every prison in the country, the numbers of people serving these different types of sentences and how these patterns have changed over the last 2 decades. But she's going to present today this remarkable new book. It's been getting rave reviews and lots of wonderful book review and media outlets. There are copies outside for sale and for signature if you'd like an autographed copy. I need to get my copy autographed, actually. But we'd love to have questions from you all, so we'll make sure we leave time for that. Let's welcome Ashley, and we're really excited to hear the story of this book and to have a conversation about it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for giving your time to this pretty depressing topic. I've been at the Sentencing Project for a little over 11 years, and when I first started there, I was 2008. And 2009, there was a Supreme Court case called Graham v. Florida. And so I quickly got into the work of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for people who were under the age of 18 at the time of their crime. And the Graham case was about Terrence Graham, who had been convicted of an armed burglary and given life without parole at the age of 17. And as a result of that ruling, we can no longer in this country give life without parole to juveniles who are convicted of a non-homicide. And my involvement in that work was very data heavy, and it has been in the time that I've been doing this work, which is to focus on the numbers of people serving life sentences, the characteristics of the people serving life sentences, and sort of documenting the expansion of life imprisonment across the U.S. So that has always been sort of the contribution that I make to the field. With Terrence's case, I documented that about 80% of the life sentences given to juveniles for non-homicide were coming from the state of Florida. And so that established it as a violation of the Eighth Amendment, being not only cruel but also unusual, that it was not being used anywhere else in the country hardly, but that it was being used so heavily in the state of Florida. And so after that time, I got involved in interviewing about 1,700 of the juveniles serving life without parole around the U.S. who have been convicted of homicide. And that the findings related to that research were used in Miller v. Alabama, which identified that juveniles were getting mandatory life without parole sentences once they were transferred to the adult system, just like adults always had been ever since they had mandatory life imprisonment. But in the Miller ruling, they decided that because of a host of age-related factors, you can't give juveniles life without the possibility of parole in a mandatory sentencing scheme. North Carolina is one of those states. And so in the course of my interviewing these individuals, it was clear that the childhoods that they had were considerably different than what we would consider to be your typical childhood. They were marked with a lot of abuse, a lot of parental incarceration, substance abuse, mental health, physical, sexual abuse. 80% of the girls serving life without parole had been sexually assaulted as children. And so there were these themes that were very clear. And what the justices decided as a majority was that as juveniles, these kids were not able to extricate themselves from that childhood experience. And so this put them as less culpable for the acts that they went on to commit, and that they should receive a second look down the road, not necessarily be released, but that they should get a second look. And life without parole doesn't provide for that. So subsequent, another ruling that happened in 2017 was that it made the Miller ruling retroactive. So all 2,000 juveniles, in theory anyway, and it should be in practice, should get resentenced. As it stands, about half have been resentenced, and half are still awaiting that resentencing, and about 500 or so have been released. So I just wanted to talk, just to sort of establish my work on lifers so far has been those two things, and then also the Sentencing Project is the only organization in the U.S. that collects data routinely on the number of people serving life, juvenile and adult. We started this work in the early 2000s before I was at the organization, principally because our executive director, Marc Mauer, had, at the beginning of his career, which is about 40 years ago now, met lifers in Michigan, where he lived at the time. And he was really moved by the fact that they had been in the prison system for 30 years or so already. They were very different people from the people that had, committed their crime at the time. And yet they were completely, exiled and with no opportunity for a second look. And the experience of meeting those lifers stayed with him, and that has been my experience too. And is that these are people who committed serious crimes, no question. Most of them committed a homicide or a rape or a series of very serious aggravated assaults, but they are more than that worst time in their lives. And for some of them, that will become very evident. In fact, for most of them, that becomes very evident over time. So we collect this information on the expansion of life sentences for all people, juveniles and adults, every 4 years. And I'm in the middle of that data collection right now for 2020. I can tell you, if you don't run to the press, that North Carolina has outpaced itself once again, and has over 4,000 people serving life sentences in the state now, and has steadily increased not just its life sentence. So there's 3 kinds of life sentences in North Carolina. There's a virtual life sentence, which we would define as somebody who has 50 years or more. There's life with the possibility of parole, and then there's life without the possibility of parole. Of those 3, North Carolina, like many states, has increased its life without parole the most rapidly over time. So within these sentences that are already fairly extreme, life without parole is usually rising the most quickly. So in the course of our documenting life sentences over time, we have discovered that there are today more people serving life sentences in the United States, which is about 1 in 7 people in prison has a life sentence. There are more people today serving a life sentence than the entire prison population back in 1970. We're sometimes asked, why do you pick 1970? 1970 is a period of time when we kind of defined the beginning of our era on mass incarceration, 1972 or so, when we started to see the rise, when Nixon declared the war on drugs, in the 80s when federal mandatory minimums were put in place for drug offenses, and we see this very steep rise in the prison population. We probably all know what that chart looks like. For life sentences, it's actually increased even more rapidly. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to write this book, Marc and myself, is that we are sort of in this moment quickly vanishing moment probably, but a moment of criminal justice reform. People are talking about criminal justice from all walks of life. Everybody knows about mass incarceration. A lot of people know about the Jim Crow era in terms of its relationship to mass incarceration. There's Orange is the New Black. It's just very popular to talk about criminal justice. And so one of the cautions about this enthusiasm for reforming the criminal justice system is that it's going to miss the mark if it doesn't include the people who are there serving for a serious crime, because 50% of people in prison are there for a serious crime. And so while it's very important to deal with low-level nonviolent, to decriminalize crimes that are widely accepted in other countries, and to seek things like bail reform and moving some felonies to misdemeanors, those are all very important reforms. They're not going to have the impact on mass incarceration that we want it to unless we also take a look at the deep end of the system. And one of the things that we see in criminal justice reform conversations these days is that there's not only a sort of exclusion of people at the deep end of the system for reform, but sometimes a bargaining, right? We're going to make it even harder for people at the deep end of the system, and then as a way to leverage getting this reform at the lower end. So even people like Elizabeth Warren recently, I don't know if anybody noticed this, said that she was for life without parole instead of the death penalty because it's like really, really bad. And so, I mean, Elizabeth Warren doesn't strike me as anything but like the most progressive Democrat you could pretty much ask for. And even somebody like that is saying things like, we want to keep things really tough. And so life without parole is the way to do that. So anyway, so we are currently in the process of collecting and reporting and analyzing these new data. And that will sort of give a sense of where things are in terms of the expansion of life sentences. But in a nutshell, about 1 in 7 people in prison today is serving life imprisonment. About 12,000 of them were under the age of 18 at the time of their crime, according to those 3 definitions of life with, life without, and virtual life. There are another 12,000, unrelated to that, 12,000 who are there for a nonviolent crime, a drug offense, a property offense. The majority are there for a serious crime of a homicide. About 3% of the people who are serving life sentences are women. And we are currently also looking at that in this research study to see the extent to which those women, their crime of conviction differs from the typical male who's serving life without parole. And then we're also going to be looking at elderly prisoners. So we're asking a question in this year's survey for the first time about the number of people serving life sentences who are age 55 or older. So in our book, we document a lot about how we got to this place internationally as being a real outlier in extreme sentences. And we talk about places like Germany and Norway where it is really unfathomable that there would be a sentence longer than 15 years. The expectation is that when somebody comes to prison, they will be coming out in 15 to 20 years, and that it is the job of the corrections system to make that person ready. That is their number one job 24/7, is to get that person ready for their release. And it's really sort of the burden is on the state, the burden is on the government if that person isn't ready, for the most part. Here, of course, we don't have that way of looking at it. We have it where when you arrive at prison with a life sentence, you are typically excluded from programming. You're typically put at the very end of a wait list because you're not expected to ever get out of prison. Or you're not expected to get out of prison for 25 years or 45 years. In Tennessee, a life without parole, life with the possibility of parole, you have to wait 60 years before your first parole hearing. With good time, you could have a parole hearing in 51 years. But that's standard. There's no way around that. That's life with parole in Tennessee. So the people who are in Tennessee serving life, they are put at the very back of the line of all programming, or excluded from it altogether because of their lifer status. In Arizona, for instance, it's part of the state statute, not just DOC policy. It's part of the state statute that is, if you have a life sentence, you cannot participate in programming. It's also part of the statute, and this is important because it's Arizona. If you don't speak English, you cannot participate in any programming. And so, if you're not fluent in English, and so, there are these huge obstacles put in place against people who are serving lengthy terms of imprisonment. And those work against the person when they do end up in front of a parole board. And then the parole board wants to know what they've been doing for the last 20 years. The way the politics of parole goes is that if the state hasn't gotten rid of parole altogether, which it has in about 10 states or so, and the federal government, there is no parole board anymore, then the parole board is weighting very heavily the crime of conviction. And that is not to say the crime of conviction doesn't matter, but when it comes to the life sentence, the vast majority of them are there for a homicide. And that's not something they can get around. They've been convicted. That was what was covered at the trial. And so now they've served their 25, 30 years, and they go before the parole board, and the parole board says, you need to wait because you've been convicted of a murder, which is something that was established decades ago. And so a lot of times lifers find that they are sort of litigated again when they get in front of the parole board, instead of it being like other countries where the parole board is turning to things like, where would you live if you were released? Do you have family? How does what are your job prospects? And how will you basically contribute positively to society, showing that this is what their game plan is when they get out. Here we don't have that kind of approach. The parole boards in the U.S. are problematic, if you're lucky enough to even get in front of one. We talk in the book also about the policies that got us to the expanded position that we're in. And principally we talk about policies like 3 strikes, habitual offender laws, mandatory minimums. 29 states have mandatory life without parole for a homicide conviction. In some states, like in Massachusetts and in Pennsylvania, it's a mandatory life without parole for both first and second degree homicide. So if you are the accessory in a crime, if you were the getaway, it's mandatory life without parole. And then in a handful of other states, they also have mandatory life without parole, but they call it something different. So I was just learning about here in North Carolina, that's not considered second degree. If you're going along with a felony and you're engaged in a felony in which a homicide occurs, that can be counted as a first degree. So everybody goes down. In Texas, they call it law of parties, right? So everybody goes down on the sentence for one homicide, regardless of the relationship that the person had to the actual crime of homicide. So mandatory minimums and 3 strikes are kind of how those come about. We also have a system in place that is very, very slowly coming undone, which is juvenile transfer. So in the late 80s and early 90s to the late 90s, all states, every state in the union, and North Carolina was a big offender on this, found ways to move juveniles into the adult system based on the crime of conviction, based on the crime that they'd been charged with, or their age at the time, or the prosecutor's discretion, right? So the prosecutor could just say, I think that this person is better suited in the adult system. So states have come some matters of ways in terms of reversing those, but a lot of the 12,000 juveniles that we see in the adult system serving life sentences is because of the transfer laws. Once you're moved into the adult system, you are vulnerable to a life sentence, and in many cases that's mandatory. I forget what North Carolina's age of majority is now. is it
Just went up
right to 17?
December 1st. So 16 to 17-year-olds are now in the delinquency system.
Okay, and 17, right. So, okay, so yeah, the age of criminal majority then is 18. Right, okay. Yeah, so in North Carolina was one of the last states on that. It's like North Carolina, Wisconsin, and
New York,
and Georgia? I forget. But yeah, it's not very many states are left with that. I mean, you can always still transfer a juvenile into the adult system at a young age in most states. But this was all 16-year-olds are tried as adults for a long time here and in a few other states. And so let's see. So what else do I want to say? I want to leave a lot of room for us to discuss, so I don't want to talk much past 1 o'clock. But I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of other topics, which are that how life sentences advocacy works with death penalty abolition, and also sort of why, in our view, and how we cover in the book, life sentences just don't make common sense. So I'll start with the common sense. So there are two reasons that the policy really doesn't work as we kind of think that it will intuitively, is that most people don't think they're going to be caught. That's the biggest issue. So when we ratchet up sentences to life without, and we keep making them tougher and tougher and tougher, we are assuming that people who are considering committing crime are reviewing those statutory changes and are saying, oh, wow, so it's now 35 years before parole. Maybe I won't commit this robbery, because they don't think they're going to be caught. Most people, and a lot of people aren't caught. So they're not that off, but they, there's this focus in our criminal justice system on making the punishment harsher, rather than making it more likely that the person will be apprehended in the first place. And a lot of the research, all of the research, points to the fact that people are much more likely to change their behavior if they know they'll be caught in the first place than if they know how long the sentence is. To add on top of this, about 60-65% of the people who are committing their crime are usually inebriated in some way or have a mental health issue. So they're not really making the right risk ratios to begin with. And so when we sort of assume that if we just make it harsh enough, people will stop doing it, it doesn't pan out with the research. This has actually helped me a lot with parenting, and because even though I know all this, I've thought, like, if I just say you won't have dessert for a whole week, they won't do it, and they still do it. But that's another matter. So, that's one of the issues, is that, there's this heavy weight put on the severity of the sentence and not enough weight and not enough resources put on the likelihood of the initial apprehension. The other issue that we talk about significantly in the book is this concept of aging out. So people have studied crime for years, and they've studied criminal offending for decades. There's been a study that followed people who were born in the 1930s all the way up until they were 85 years old, and their trajectory on serious offending. There's many other studies. All of them indicate that when people are at risk for committing crime, they are most at risk for committing crime from their late teenage years until the end of their 20s. That is when the brain is going through adolescent development. That is when people are take the most risks in life. That is before they have sort of stable connections, before they're married. This is a typical person. They're married, they have a job, they have children. They would have bigger losses if they just decided to go out and rob a bank. So there are these, developments that happen in the average life that point to how people tend to engage in crime and then over time desist in crime. That happens whether they are incarcerated or not. So if you take juveniles, for instance, who have been given life without parole, obviously they're offending. But when we look, and I did this for a case in Arizona, when we look at the disciplinary patterns of juveniles over time while they're incarcerated compared to the adult lifers in over time. Juveniles have a harder time adjusting, and part of that is because they are still developing. Part of that is also because they're juveniles in an adult prison, but it is part of sort of typical development, maybe not more normal development, but typical development for people to engage in more risks in their late teens and 20s. And even the chronic offender, the person who is convicted of maybe 7 robberies or more, is very unlikely to commit more crime after the age of 40. It doesn't seem like it. I mean, I'm with everyone on this. It doesn't seem like it, but that is what the research shows. And so the research shows that people tend to age out of crime by even the worst ones, those are not necessarily homicide, but the most chronic, most repeat offenders will typically age out by the time they're 40. So I personally believe that there can be some value to incarceration. I think that it's important when we get a chronic robber, off the streets for a little while. I think that when we keep that person in prison until they're 70 or 80 years old, I think we're wasting our money. And I'm talking right now with an inmate in Wisconsin who is there on a drug conviction under a serious habitual offender law. He has life without parole. He's in his 80s. He's had a double hip replacement, courtesy of the state, and all of that is being paid for by the taxpayers. Rather than to move him into a hospice, he is not going to commit a new crime. He can barely walk. And, he is somebody, and who knows how many others there are, who has definitely aged out of crime and is now a cost burden on the state. Usually a lifer will cost, if they come to the system in their 20s, let's say, they'll cost the system maybe $1 million over the course of their life. If it's a juvenile, sometimes $2 million because they come in younger and they have more needs for segregation and all this stuff. So there's this idea out there that once you are this way, you will always be this way. But we know that. Most people in this room are probably in their 20s. But when you're in your 30s and 40s, you will look back on your 20s. I promise you. And you may not say, boy, I shouldn't have killed that person, but you will say, I did make some decisions I would definitely not make today. So those are the two sort of principal reasons that we say, sort of on common sense grounds, life sentences are not a good idea. We talk in the final sections of our book about reforms, and some of those reforms deal with capping the sentence at, let's say, 20 years, and then having a review with expected release after 20 years. In most other countries, that's considered normal. We've been at this a while, so it doesn't feel normal yet. And we realize, as the authors of the book, that this is not going to happen overnight. In 20 years, if someone were given a parole hearing, that doesn't seem that outrageous to me, but it's not something that's going to be passing in any legislature very soon for adults. For juveniles, it is working, but that is an idea we put out there. We also focus on, releasing aging prisoners, people who are 70 years and older, who have already served 25 years or so. And we focus on the juveniles. So the JLWOP movement is very big, life without parole for juveniles, but there's an additional 8,000 who have life with parole around the country, and their sentences have mostly been untouched. And then we talk about, in the book, reforming our parole, making it less politicized and less, vulnerable to shifts in the political landscape, and also making just administrative changes, making parole boards less, so in some states you have to have a unanimous vote for release, in other states you don't. In some states you have to have certain credentials to be on the parole board, in other states the credentials are different. And so making it more streamlined and more evidence-based, and having actual experts on the parole board who can judge risk. Because that should be the point at a parole board hearing, is what is the risk of this person offending? And how can we support minimizing that risk? And then we also talk about how to work, without undermining the great successes that have been made in death penalty abolition work. So we, the Sentencing Project does not get into the issue of death penalty because it's its own area. I can tell you we are all adamantly opposed to the death penalty. And we, if forced to choose between the two, it would be a very difficult decision to make. But one of the ways that we want to support the death penalty abolition work is to show how life without parole is too small of a goal for really bringing us into a humane range of punishments. So just because we incarcerate a person for the rest of their life, considering we consider ourselves to be a human rights leader across the world, I feel like we could do a little bit better than that as the humane alternative. And so, while we don't actively work in any states that are trying to abolish the death penalty, for instance, Colorado right now is very close to eliminating the death penalty, we would never go into that state and actively work to eliminate life sentences at the same time. We try to have conversations and engage in dialogues because we're all ultimately on the same team. Life, I think there isn't, well, I don't know this for sure, but I know a lot of people who oppose the death penalty who are abolitionists who also think life sentences are very problematic. And they share many of the same traits that we find so problematic in the death penalty, right? So there's the access to counsel is even more problematic for people facing a life sentence. The appeals process is shortened for people with a life sentence. And there are a number of other issues. Certainly the innocence issue has not even begun to be broached for lifers, whereas when we look at the death penalty, we see that it's a significant issue that a lot of the people who are on death row, not a lot, but enough of the people who are on death row were actually not guilty of that crime. And so it just makes you wonder how many are serving life sentences who haven't had those kind of resources or that kind of attention to their case after their conviction. So I think I'll leave it there and welcome any questions. We have about 20 minutes or so, and I would love to just open it up for dialogue and hear more about why you came.
Everybody, thank you.
I've got one right here.
So as you noted, even somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who's a very kind of progressive politician, even she's not going to publicly come out against a life without parole sentences. So I guess what rhetoric would you advise a politician to use if they want to make a change here? Because it seems like, especially if you're a progressive politician, you always have this kind of specter of Willie Horton kind of hanging over you, and you're afraid to be seen as soft on crime.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about second look legislation. So just giving somebody a second review down the road. That seems to be, as Senator Booker has a bill actually called the second look bill. And I mean, he's pretty progressive, but there are ways to talk about it that don't pit one sentence against the other, I think, and that open up the possibility of life with parole. I'm not opposed to life with the possibility of parole. As long as it's a meaningful opportunity for parole. So I think giving. It's hard to get to these candidates with the right message. I mean, it's just enough to get them to stop talking about private prisons, But but to get them to talk about life sentences in an appropriate way is, nobody knew that she was going to say that. And, she wants to look tough on crime because the progressives always are beaten up for being too soft on crime. But I think a good way of talking about it is a second look, because most people can get behind a second look, it seems like. But I don't know.
Yeah, so as you've alluded to, there's study after study that show that long sentences do not deter, and one of them is, as you said, like criminals aren't going to look at the statute before they start committing crimes. But then another thing that we talked about in our criminology class is that prison systems, they don't adequately equip defendants or people with the skills to reintegrate back to life in society. So then they have trouble reintegrating. They have the risk of recidivating. So what are structural things or even just particular things that we can look for or advocate for so that we're not putting people who need help back in prison where they're not going to get it?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue because the prisons themselves are not helping. I will say, though, that lifers groups are all over the country, and they have formed on their own by lifers, for lifers. And so there's this growing sort of movement of people who were on life sentence and have been released and have gone back to mentor people who are still serving life. And so that is not something that's, happening by the prison system. That's happening in spite of the prison system. And most of the growth that we see, most of the acceptance of their sentence, most of the transformation that lifers report in books about lifers with, that have done qualitative studies of, what is it like to live a life sentence, find that a certain internal transformation is required. And they almost never credit the system with providing that. But more and more, they credit other lifers, older lifers. The lifers, the older ones have been there and are usually sort of a calming force on the prison. They're usually trustees in the southern states where they still have those. And they, they get this sort of respect in the prison system because they're able to get younger prisoners to behave themselves in a way that the guards are maybe not so successful. So I think, building up those lifers groups is a good way, trying to get administrations to support lifers work. And a lot of the lifers, those lifers groups, they follow legislation. That's a big activity of theirs. But they also have a lot of internal cognitive, therapy kinds of groups among them of just getting through the experience of being incarcerated for life. So, I would love to see states, sponsor that more. I don't know that that'll ever happen, but that is where I definitely see a lot of success. I know a few lifers, and there's some of them in here, but also in my own work when I've done talks, if there's a released lifer who I know of, sometimes we'll talk together. I am most impressed with those. I mean, their lives have truly been transformed. And that they would go back to the prison after that, after they finally get out, just goes to show how much of an impact this has had on them.
Thanks for a great talk. I had a question about your reform on making parole less politicized.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you could, because I think a lot of what you're talking about really comes down to the parole process. And I wonder if you could say more about why parole should be sort of more of a judicial process with experts and less of a democratic process with political influence. And do you think parole should just be decided by totally separate from any democratic participation?
So I wouldn't call it a judicial process. I mean, I wouldn't call it that as a good thing when it comes to parole. I think ideally we would want a parole system that was comprised of experts in terms of social workers, psychologists, behavior analysts, rather than judges and law enforcement and victims, which is what it currently is dominated by, victims' families. And so I think that would, provide just more information about the person's risk at release, rather than trying to, make it this adversarial process like the court case was. There's a lot stacked against the lifer when they go before parole board. I can tell you in California, and I don't know what it's like here, but in California, when a lifer goes before the parole board, they cannot speak to the victim's family, even though the victim's family can speak to them. They can't speak to them, and they can't look at them. And so what that sort of comes across as is disingenuous. So that's one of the issues. The prosecutor can come and is invited, but the prisoner cannot have an attorney. And they can't have a representative. So what has happened in California is there's an organization that I'm on the board for called Uncommon Law. And the executive director of that, he coaches for maybe like 2 years, he coaches the lifers on how to sort of present yourself the best in front of the parole board. And he gets to know them over that course. You have to sort of select, you got to first win it over with Keith, that you're actually legit, that you're going to be good on the outside. And then when you go before the parole board, he can go because he's a mentor. And you're sort of coached into how to get through the parole board hearing in the best way possible. But that's a nonprofit organization. That's not part of the system. That's an organization that's come because of a huge gap in the system. So I guess that's one way would be, if there was more support for the prisoner, at the time that they went before parole, to give their best case, for why they should get released. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really ignorant about prisons, so I'll just throw out an ignorant question. But what are the variety that you're aware of humanizing practices that prisons entail?
Say that a different way?
Well, in what ways are prisons not just places where somebody sits in a cell all day long and you get a little food stuck in through the bar, etc. But what are the intentionally humanizing practices that prisons may employ?
Well, I mean, that you have to have a job when you're in prison, and you have to go to your job every day.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, the lifers. Sometimes clerical, sometimes you're in the kitchen, sometimes you're doing computer work, sometimes you're doing labor outside. It kind of depends.
Leave the prison.
You don't leave the prison, no.
Oh.
It's all in the prison. Yeah. So that is strict. If you don't show up to work, that's a disciplinary. You have to go to work. Usually they're out of their cell very early in the morning, 6 a.m., and they don't come back maybe till 8. They're busy. They're not just sitting around watching TV. They're busy, and they engage in some social activities, but mostly it's a lot of work. And I don't know what the salary is here, but in Arizona, where I did some more specific work, you make 40 cents an hour. And that's it. And you can, and if you want to send, mail or phone or buy something at the commissary, all that, that's what you spend your money on. So in some states you can do email. I don't think North Carolina is one of them, but you can do email if you're a certain level of security. So they pay 10 cents for every email. So, that's it's expensive. So they work all day for the most part. So that's an important skill that you develop. They learn that there are rules to follow, and they learn over time to follow those rules. I've heard from lifers who come out. There's a group in Louisiana who does similar work to the California group I was telling you about. This guy helps people when they come out, and he says that they are, when his lifers come out, and he's sort of training them on how to get through that first week or month. They're very low risk, but they're very high needs because they have had so much done for them for so long. That an alarm goes off and they get up. They have to be in a certain place at they have no autonomy and no authority anymore because it's prison. So it's a completely different, management. So they not only do they not know how to deal with a cell phone and social media and all that, but they also don't understand how to govern themselves, with like autonomy. And also how to, go after a job. Because they're not taught to be assertive in prison. They're taught to be submissive. So that doesn't really land you a job very well in an interview. So there's all this like training that goes on about all of that. And that is the bulk of this colleague of mine. And he's actually, come to think of it, he's the third person on here. It says includes 6 portraits by lifer Carrie Myers. Carrie Myers is this person I'm telling you about. He started this organization in Louisiana, and he was a lifer himself. He served, I think, I don't know, maybe almost 30 years in Angola, and which is in Louisiana, one of the toughest prisons. It's almost all lifers there. So he's been out not that long, less than 5 years, and he's made it his life's work to help other people who are coming up. But they are low risk, but they're high needs. They don't have any of these human skills, soft skills, any of it when they come out.
Well, I have had the impression that North Carolina has a bad reputation for prison stuff, but I don't remember specifics. Is that true? You're nodding your head.
No, I'm following your question. I can't speak about North Carolina. I know one prisoner, this guy Anthony. I know he works like a dog. He works all day long. So I know he's working. I don't know what the typical, maybe one of you guys can speak better about what a typical day is like for a lifer in North Carolina.
I think the prisons are terribly understaffed,
Uh-huh.
and it causes problems with programming and things of that nature.
Well, I just got through doing a life sentence
Oh, you did?
6 months ago.
Oh, wow. And you're already here?
Yeah, I was innocent in the Duke wrongful conviction. Teresa and Jim
Okay.
and Jamie them got me out after 10 years of fighting.
Innocent? Uh-huh.
My name Dante Sharp.
Oh, okay.
And I'm glad to be here. I didn't think 6 months ago, but I was just sitting here listening. I wasn't going to say that. I was trying to let the guys, the kids really get all their questions off. And everything you said was true, even for the other states. And some of it shocked me because North Carolina really behind on a lot of the stuff in prison. They're short staffed, but also it's a mentality that, if you in prison, that you are animal. That I'm just going to speak it how it is, I went in there, I did 26 years. You get paid 40 cents a day.
Oh, a day. Maybe it was a day. Sorry.
You get 40 cents a day on certain jobs. You get 70 cents a day on some. I done worked all of them. As lifers get to go outside the fence, that's when you get a called honor grade. You get green clothes. That's when you done did over 20 years. Like me, I had an old law life. I had a class A life. First, I had no parole. I came in the system. I got locked up. I was just turning 18. I understand what you were talking about. They used to not let you. They used to then let you leave the youth spread to go to the adult spread.
Right. Yeah.
Unless you could show that you were mature enough to go there, because they would get killed. Because a lot of young guys like to fight. Mm-hmm. Older guys tell you they're not going to fight you, they're going to kill you. That's just how it was. I was at Foothills up in Morganton, the youth spread. I went to Old Pope Youth Center. I started out there. Then I went because I had a Class A life sentence. I had to go to Foothills in Morganton. And when you're there, if you act up, it was guys there that was, when I was there, they were 28 years old, 29, because they were acting up. And back then, in the 90s, they were scared to send them to adult spread because them older guys was stabbing them and things like that. So, but I went to school. I always stay to myself. I make my own decision. I don't let nobody else around me make my decision for me, no matter the consequence. If they didn't like me, so what? But I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. And since I done got this life sentence, I'm going to do what's right because I see what time it is now, So I went in and they called me one day and was like, we transferring you to one of the worst. It was a new Pasquotank in Elizabeth City. At the time, it was one of the worst prisons. They had just built it. And they sent all the people off death row that got the changed from death to life. They sent a lot of them there. So my case manager called me in the room and was like, man, we're going to go on and ship you close to your family. Don't you got family in Virginia and North Carolina? I said, yeah. And he was like, we're going to send you there. I said, all right. So I went back in the block and I was like, yeah, man, they shipping me. I was like 20. I was 20. They were like, man, how the way you get shipped so fast? Man, how the way I've been here 6 years, I've been here. And then the dude said, man, you know what? You see how Tay do every day? He read his Bible. He go to school. He chill. He work out. He stay away from the foolishness, all the crazy talking over there. And the people seen that. They watch you closely at the youth spread. And they seen that. And so when I put my transfer in, he said, oh, man, you can go. But most times they don't ship people until you can show them. And I know guys that stay there 6, 7, 8 years. Did
you go to Elizabeth City for how many years then?
I stayed 2 years. I stayed at Pasquotank Correctional for 2 years.
And then what about the rest of it? after that?
I went to, I got a transfer. They helped me get transferred. I left there and went to Eastern. That was 15 minutes from my mother's house. That's why I went there. It's 15 minutes from Greenville, Pitt County, where I'm from. And then I stayed there a couple of months, and then I left there and I transferred to Burgaw. That's out there more about 30 minutes from Wilmington. Then I left there and I went to Harnett Correctional in Harnett County. And I stayed there like 6 years, because that's known as the college campus, where you get 4-year degrees and 2-year degrees. I went there to do that, but when I went there, like you were saying, by you having a class, especially a class, we had 3 different lives back then in the 90s, 80s and 90s. Late 70s up to 94 when they changed. And we had a class A, B, and C. The C is mandatory 15. B is 15, C is 10. Mandatory 10 before parole. 15 is mandatory, B is mandatory 15 before parole. And a class A could be no parole or 20 years mandatory. First I had a no parole, but they changed it because I had made a mistake or something, I guess, in the computer. I had no parole for a while. Then they turned around and gave me 20-year parole. So I did 26 years, but I got exonerated because I was going to turn parole down anyway because I was innocent. You know,
And were you on death row first, or no?
No, ma'am.
Oh, okay.
They said they couldn't try me for the death penalty if I had aggravating factors in line, but I wasn't. Yeah. But I went through that, just got out on that, and I was just sitting here listening. They invited me here to come, and I'm glad I did. It's the second one I came to, and one with him before the other week. Yeah, that was pretty good. And this here really, and I was sitting here kind of torn. I had a life sentence, don't get me wrong.
Yes.
And I did a life sentence. I was listening to you talk, about abolishing the life sentence. And I was checking myself, because I'm thinking I'm tripping in my mind, because with my mind, when I'm hearing you saying about abolishing, and I'm just thinking about, I was in there, and I try to be a straightforward person no matter what, around lifers. Because all of us mostly mingle together. Mm-hmm. We dealt with the young guys that came to us, because a lot of young guys don't want to hear nothing you got to say, because a lot of them didn't have a man in their life to tell them something. They don't want to, who you think you is, you in here with me. You get that a lot. So we just let them come to us, but anyway, when you was talking, and I'm hearing you talking about, abolishing life sentence, in my mind I'm saying, in prison now we say, you rather have life than death. Mm-hmm. That's what we say. Because you rather not be sitting on death row and possibly get executed, and then because you feel like if you can get off death row and get a life sentence, maybe someday you'll get parole. That's how guys look at it. And they feel like, man, because a lot of guys I know got life sentences by taking pleas to avoid the death penalty.
Right.
So they look at that as long as they're still alive.
Yeah.
But then I know guys that's actually they're sick with diabetes and don't want to take the treatment because they figure that'll help them get out of prison, because they take them and send them to a medical honor grade camp, and they eventually send them letters and parole them. So what you were saying, all of it was true. That's why I was sitting here listening. And I was just saying, I know guys and I know how the life is, because medical care is not good for lifers. They know you got to be in there all the time, and they don't really take care of you. You got to literally fall out in front of an officer to get taken, to get stuff done to you, unless you already on your deathbed. I've seen that so many times. Lifers get blocked from school. That's what happened to me. I had a class A, and life sentence, that's 20 mandatory or no parole. And they was like, they wanted me to go because I'm known as a school man in prison. I just went to school. I said, well, if I got to be in for something I didn't do, I'm going to take advantage of every program they got. And when I started doing that, and as I got older, they came up with the laws. Laws change like every couple of years. And we noticed that too. And they told me I couldn't go to school. A lot of lifers were like, man, they came and took me out of class, man. And said I couldn't take it no more. Even a lot of the colleges didn't even like it.
Yeah, oh yeah,
a lot of the colleges didn't like it. It was the prisons and the system that was doing that. Yes. Then they would come back later on and be like, well, since you're such a good student, we're going to let you back. When they couldn't get the regular guys that didn't have life, take the classes. Then they came back to the life. And I was like, no, a lot of us came together. We were like, nah, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Second hand or something,
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for.
I ain't talk so long either, but
No, it's great. I mean, it's much better, to get a real live version of the whole thing, than anything I could ever say. So appreciate that. And lifers are getting out slowly, and they're helping other lifers, and that is just like incredible to me. Or just sharing their experience. to bring a human face to the sentence, because I think prisons are designed to be far away, throw away the key, and so you don't ever have to see a person again after they've been convicted and sentenced to life. So, I have there's a saying in our world that if every politician was forced to spend a day in prison, we'd have a lot fewer people in prison, because you don't ever have to really experience the the deprivation of that freedom. And sometimes it's necessary for a while. A lot of people go through rough times, and they need to have some structure imposed on them. But I think the point of our work and the point of our campaign that's come out as a result of this book is to bring it back into line with our society's values about human beings and our second chances. We're supposedly this country made of second chances, and we have a prime opportunity to do that here with people who have shown over a course of decades that they are worthy of that second chance. So I think are there any other questions or comments? It's hard to beat an actual life work.
I guess
Go ahead.
one of the questions I have is, I come from climate organizing, not necessarily from prisons and criminal justice work.
Yes.
And I know for us, a lot of the past 20, 30, 40 years was spent saying that, oh, look how much it'll cost if we don't address climate change, and if we make these minor tweaks, we'll get there along the way. And in the past year, we've seen this shift from saying, we're not going to talk about economic costs, we're going to talk about human costs. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's been any similar consideration around the justification of it being cheaper to end life sentences. To me, strikes me as not really addressing the core problem,
right.
Which is that, right, when we went about the era of mass incarceration, we were using words coded in race in order to put people in jail.
Right. Yeah, no, I put the cost out there, a typical cost. That's not a big winning argument, because most people are, they're afraid of being victimized, and they'll pay any price to not have that happen. Or, and victimized, maybe that means they're afraid of people of different races. Whatever that means, it's a fear-based policy. Because it doesn't make any logical sense. So I typically don't use the economic argument. That is more on there are conservatives who are opposed to life sentences and the death penalty, and that is an argument that works for some people. For me, I don't think that that's a winning argument. I think it's more that if this is a public safety issue, then this is not a public safety solution, because you meet lifer after lifer who's served, a decade or so, and they're completely docile. So there is no worry about reoffending for the most part, or something that can't be handled with a lot of support systems in place. So I think we're on sort of the same page with that. And it's been a 40-year buildup as well. So.
Thank you so much, Anne. Actually, it's such a treat to have you back here at Duke.
Yeah,
Come
yeah.
back anytime.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Great to have you back, Dante. I hope you can come every Tuesday. Over to you.
It was her sister. She was the attorney from California.
Do you want to?
But I want